What do a crow and a desk have in common? Wonders the Mad Hatter in the well-known fairy tale. We have a more interesting question. What does Alice in Wonderland have in common with the confession of a man who's attracted to little girls? Rereading the fairy tale as an adult, whether you like it or not, you begin to look differently at most of the details in the whimsical Wonderland, and the ambiguous biography of the author gives rise to many disturbing assumptions. From beginning to end, the story resembles a vivid trip, and Freud's adepts everywhere note allusions to intercourse, phallic symbols, gender envy, and various sexual complexes and deviations. What non-children's content does Wonderland hide in itself? Did its author, Lewis Carroll, really have unhealthy tendencies, and was the Alice's story created under the influence of mind-altering substances? Today, we'll try to figure it all out together. The story begins with the fact that the young girl Alice is sitting on the bank of the river next to her sister and is bored. She's about to drift off to sleep when suddenly she sees the White Rabbit, dressed like a real gentleman. Alice instantly jumps out of curiosity and runs after him. The rabbit jumps into the hole under the bush, and the girl jumps after him without any hesitation. The dark hole into which the main character falls suddenly turns into a deep well which the girl flies down. Already in this flight, she begins to communicate with herself. Moreover, her monologue sounds quite inadequate. Is it just childish nonsense, a mental disorder, or even a substance abuse condition? It would seem strange to talk about substances at all, as the book is supposed to be childish and innocent, but this white rabbit with red eyes is often considered a symbol of white powder. In addition to the color, the very behavior of this character clearly hints at how a person behaves under the influence of this substance: fussiness, increased psychomotor excitement, constant activity. So, it's by following this white trail that our Alice finds herself in a different reality, talks to herself, and this is only the beginning. After jumping into a dark hole, we find ourselves in a world that can absolutely be called not only whimsical, but also one that's often seen by people who use substances capable of changing the state of consciousness. Was the author of this story, Charles Lutwig Dodgson, a fan of certain mind-altering substances? Despite the fact that many researchers of his life claim that he was not, this does not exclude the fact that he has had such an experience. The fact is that the use of various dangerous things, such as opiates and white powder, was widespread in the Victorian era. Not only did opium cost less than alcohol due to anti-alcohol laws, but medicine at that time did not know their true harm, or pretended not to. A large number of the most popular medicines of that time contained dangerous components. Laudanum was especially popular. Opium tincture on alcohol, which was used as a universal medicinal sedative and hypnotic agent. It was often prescribed for various types of disorders, including migraines and depression. So, Mr. Dodgson was a faithful follower of laudanum because of his constant migraines and nervous conditions. This is a fact. Add to this the probability of states of altered consciousness during severe migraines, and we can safely assume that the experience of hallucinations, altered perception, and states of altered consciousness must have been well known to him. That's why, with his imagination throughout the fairy tale, the girl will often change, both internally and physically, precisely because of the ingestion of something inside. Sometimes a mixture, then pies, then a mushroom. By the way, the first version of the book's title was Alice's Adventures Underground. She fell not just into a rabbit hole, but into the underworld with completely different laws. In occult teachings, the topic of portals through which you can enter other worlds is very common. It can be bridges, doors, windows, mirrors, hollows, and, of course, holes. There's no evidence that Dodgson was interested in magic, but there is information that he belonged to one of the societies that were engaged in the research of psychics and other paranormal phenomena. And therefore, Alice, chasing the inhabitant of a parallel world, could use a means capable of enhancing the perception of subtle matters. Because shamans, magicians, and other fraternities used substances to change consciousness, allegedly in order to establish a connection with the supernatural. The flight ended with Alice falling into a pile of dry leaves. According to psychologists, the act of falling, whether in a dream or in a state of altered consciousness, often reflects uncontrollable desires and fears, symbolizes birth or the act of penetration. But whose desires and fears prompted the author to throw Alice into the tunnel? His own desires for her, or her fears for his desires? Or maybe it's a symbol of the birth of an adult woman from a girl who'll go through a transformation. To understand, you need to delve deeper into the author's biography. In real life, Alice had her prototype, a 10-year-old girl named Alice Liddell. It was for her and her two sisters that Dodgson came up with this tale during their joint walk in 1862. The girls were the daughters of the dean of Christ Church, Oxford College, where the writer taught, and from this moment there appeared to be a rather dark and ambiguous story which was hidden behind the writing of Alice in Wonderland. Under the pseudonym Lewis Carroll, an English writer, mathematician, philosopher, Anglican priest, and photographer, created a whimsical world of Wonderland and lured the hearts of millions of children there. But were his intentions so innocent? Nowadays, the friendship of an adult man with little girls would at least raise questions. If you add to this the fact that Dodgson, the photographer, liked to take pictures of little girls, often in minimal clothing, albeit with the permission of their parents, then it raises real concerns about his inclinations. Did Charles Dodgson have an unhealthy attraction to children? No real evidence has yet been found for this. His relationship with his family suffered a sudden rupture in June 1863, and the reasons have been unknown. The family's never commented, and the page in Dodgson's diary that recorded the days surrounding the split has also disappeared. There are theories that Dodgson expressed his desire to marry Alice, who was 11 years old at the time, and that's what caused the quarrel. But it's worth noting that the age of consent at that time was 12 years old, and it was raised to 16 only in 1885. Therefore, no matter how wild it may sound now, the problem was not so much age, but the fact that the girl's parents planned to choose a more suitable party for her. One way or another, we cannot ignore the fact that although Dodgson also photographed men, women, and landscapes, more than 50% of the photographs that have survived to this day were of girls. Perhaps this is explained by his interest in their purer view of the world, according to the then Victorian cult of children in minimal clothing as the embodiment of innocence. But still, we won't avoid the possible intimate undertones that he, perhaps subconsciously, included in the story. Because most creators, whether they want it or not, include a lot of their own essence into their works. But let's return to Alice's story. She ran further after the white rabbit, but he disappeared, and the girl found herself alone in a hall with many closed doors. In the middle stood a table on which lay a tiny golden key. Keys and doors are the most common sexual symbols, according to Freud. And what do we have here? What happened next? Well, as normal people won't cling to every word in search of sexual connotations, but the following passage does not leave many supporters indifferent to the theory of the author's hidden unhealthy passion. Because then the girl noticed a small curtain, and behind it a very narrow corridor, beyond which a small door to which the key went. And behind the door, she saw a garden of incredible beauty, which she wanted to enter more than anything in the world. The garden was closed, therefore forbidden, and also hidden behind a curtain. It may be that this description of the journey through the dark tunnel to the curtain, the narrow tunnel, the door, and the garden of paradise beyond is nothing more than a secret sexual desire. We'll not describe which exactly, everything is already clear here. But here's the problem. The passage to the garden was so small that she could only put her hand in there, and then, as if out of nowhere, a bottle with the inscription "Drink Me" appeared on the table. It seems that Alice's parents did not teach her that mindlessly shoving everything into her mouth was a very bad idea. Although the girl was generally described as quite intelligent and moderate, it would be very easy for anyone who wanted to use her for their own purposes to do so. After all, the word poison was not written on the bottle, and she, as was typical of Victorian upbringing, unquestioningly believed in the inscriptions made by adults. Rules, warnings, recommendations. So the girl calmly drank all its contents and instantly shrank to the size of a mouse. Now she could walk into the dream garden, but unfortunately she forgot the key on the table, which was now out of reach. To her delight, a small cake suddenly appeared under the table with the inscription, "Eat me," which of course she immediately swallowed. This and other transformations of the girl throughout the plot can be interpreted in two ways. On the one hand, it could be a coming-of-age metaphor that runs through the entire book. Alice, like every teenager who suddenly realizes with horror the scale of the world around her, must learn to navigate in a place that suddenly seems much bigger and scarier. The change in her body size represents the challenges that arise in the process of growing up and meeting new and unfamiliar situations. Well, on the other hand, both the bottle and the cake could contain not so much poison as some substance to change consciousness. In this case, Alice did not actually change in size. These feelings were a consequence of what she was using. In addition, in modern psychiatry, there is such a term as Alice syndrome. It's precisely about the distortion of the perception of the size of one's body, or its individual parts. It's known that it often occurs in children, but there may be another reason. People who suffer from a certain type of extreme migraines also sometimes go through this condition. What's the connection? Here, we'll return to the author of the book. Charles Dodgson's health was far from ideal. He suffered from chronic migraines, as well as epilepsy, stuttering, and partial deafness. A wonderful bunch that could give him both the experience of states of altered consciousness due to attacks and the experience of using substances as medicine. But we'll talk about this later. In the meantime, let's return to the flow of the fairy tale. After eating the pie, Alice began to grow rapidly until she hit her head on the ceiling. She was too big to go into the garden again. Out of desperation, the girl burst into tears, not for the first time and not for the last time in this strange place. Was Alice a weak, thin tear? It seems like she wasn't, considering how boldly she rushed to meet the adventure, and here we are back to growing up and transforming. In addition to purely physical, often unpleasant, incomprehensible, and even painful changes, the girl's psyche and emotional state also become part of the transformation. Hysterics, increased emotionality are some of the signs of hormonal changes. Alice constantly feels uncomfortable in her body, which is constantly undergoing transformations. Because in fact, this whole journey, which is just beginning for her, is a cruel quest, a painful and difficult task of finding one's true self. As she gets bigger and smaller, she goes through the same path as teenagers when they feel too old for some things and too young for others. But here, one thing is superimposed on another, because unstable mental states are also characteristic of a person who uses substances. And what happens to Alice next? The white rabbit appeared again on the horizon, and frightened by the huge, Alice dozed off, throwing away the fan and gloves. The girl picked them up and after waving a fan several times, suddenly began to shrink again. She grew smaller and smaller until she fell into a salt lake that turned out to be a lake of her own tears. After drying off, Alice again met the white rabbit, who was looking for a lost fan and gloves. Noticing the girl, he mistook her for his servant and ordered her to run to his house for a new pair of gloves and a fan. In his house, the girl took the necessary items and was about to run back when she saw a small bottle near the mirror. And of course, she simply couldn't help but drink or eat something unknown that she happened to find on her way. Could it be an eating disorder? Uncontrollable desire to eat can increase during stressful events, which Alice, in this dangerous world, had enough to cope with. Also, succumbing to the temptation, she again began to increase rapidly. When the rabbit ran up to his house, he saw her huge hand sticking out of the window and was terribly frightened and called his servants. Together, they tried to take Alice out of the house. The girl was no joke scared when the animals decided to burn down the house. Great way to get rid of a stranger, right? It seems that they, like the rabbit himself, were under the influence of something heavy. But before playing with fire, they tried to throw stones at her. It was painful, but the stones suddenly turned out to be cakes, after eating one of which Alice began to shrink again, ran out of the hut, and rushed to the dense forest. When she finally stopped, she noticed a large mushroom on which a giant blue caterpillar was sitting and leisurely smoking a hookah. The caterpillar and the hookah. What is this? Maybe nothing, but firstly, the caterpillar is another bright symbol of transformation, and secondly, the creature spoke as if in a dream, clearly being under the influence of what she was smoking. And even if it was only tobacco and not something more dangerous, carbon monoxide, which is released during long smoking of a hookah, and it is smoked for hours, can cause dizziness, hallucinations, and other strange reactions. The caterpillar spoke slowly, constantly asking questions, not all of which Alice could answer. And above all, the girl could not accurately answer the question, who is she? A fairly common problem among teenagers is experiencing a crisis of self-identity. I know who I was when I got up this morning, says Alice, but I think I must have changed several times since then. This quote reflects the confusion and uncertainty that often comes with growing up. Wonderland certainly has a dark side. Perhaps that's why the girl was so eager to get into that fairy tale garden behind the door, where at first glance it was cozy and safe. For example, the mushroom on which our suspicious caterpillar was sitting also turned out to be not so simple. What kind of mushroom was that? Maybe toadstool, or maybe something even cooler. But with the same success, it could be poisonous. It was very irresponsible of Dodgson to describe how time after time, a girl ate and drank things of unknown origin and nothing catastrophic happened to her, only the size of her body changed. Imagine a child who read this fairy tale and did not have an adult nearby to explain that in real life, it was very dangerous to follow the example of the main character. The girl learned from the stoned caterpillar that one end of the mushroom could make her taller and the other shorter, and the gullible child broke off a piece from each end and began to try them. She changed strangely again. Her shoulders disappeared, her neck became incredibly long, so much so that it got tangled in the branch. It's in this scene that many see a hint of an erection and even the character's envy of the male genitalia, which according to Freud, girls feel when they learn about the difference in the anatomy of sexes. Nevertheless, Alice took a bite from this piece, then from that piece, until she became the same as she was before. Now, she would definitely be able to get into the magical garden. So, experimenting with her size, she went to the edge of the forest to a small house. Entering the kitchen, she saw the Duchess nursing a baby, and a huge cat was sitting on the cake with a fearful smile from ear to ear. This was the first time Alice met the Cheshire Cat. Alice started a conversation with the Duchess, during which the woman stated that the girl did not know a lot. This noticeably affected our character, and it's not surprising because often teenagers are not ready to accept the teachings of adults, believing that they know everything well. In general, almost everyone whom Alice meets on her way tries to either command her or teach her. For example, Tweedledum and Tweedledee tell her the tale of the curious oysters, the main moral of which is that curiosity can lead to horrifying consequences. It shows how adults often use stories to control children with fear and destroy their desire to use their imagination and explore the world, telling them to stop asking questions and grow up. Tweedledum and Tweedledee represent the parents who try to keep Alice's imagination under control. The Duchess gave the baby to Alice. Very reasonable, wasn't it? And went to get ready for a game of croquet, while the girl went with the little ones to the forest because she decided it was dangerous for the baby to stay in that house. It seems like kidnapping mixed with irresponsible parenting, and it's not entirely clear which is worse. But this episode should make us understand that the main character was moving towards realizing her femininity, and that she might become a mother in the future. Here, the Cheshire Cat appeared on the tree, and learning that Alice did not care where to go because she did not know where she wanted to get to, advised her to visit the Hatter and the March Hare. This cat, of all the inhabitants of Wonderland, is the most mysterious and amazing creature. Not because of the smile, but because it could suddenly disappear or appear only in parts. Do you know who else can do that? Mystical beings that are able to move freely between dimensions and reality. He did not just become invisible, but manifested in the other world. Guide spirits also have this ability, and as we can see from the story, the Cheshire Cat also became a kind of assistant for Alice, who accompanied her throughout the second half of the story, giving advice, guiding, and keeping company in this difficult world for the girl. In front of the March Hare's house, the March Hare and the Hatter were drinking tea at a huge table. Here we learn that the Hatter and Time once had a fight, and from that moment, Time does not want to move, so the Hatter's clock is always 6 o'clock, and he's always busy drinking tea. The unfortunate Hatter does not actually live, but simply exists, stuck in the same Groundhog Day. Do you know what it looks like? On coma, time stands still for a person who has been lying unconscious for many years in a row. Physically, of course, not, but mentally, they remain in the same state they were in before the coma. They can dream, and Wonderland looks a lot like something you can dream about under IVs. And then it may turn out that Alice did not just fall asleep by that river, but almost died. From a sunstroke, for example, or from taking too many substances. This means that her entire journey is an attempt to get out of the world of the dead. It's not for nothing that the first title of the book sounded like Alice's Adventures Underground. Both the Hatter and all the others are half-dead souls who, like her, are looking for a way out, but have been here for so long that it's unlikely they'll ever get out of here. Leaving the company at the table, Alice went to the forest where she saw a door in the trunk of one of the trees, and miraculously, having entered them, she again found herself in a familiar corridor. But now, Alice already had considerable experience of dealing in this whimsical world. With a key and pieces of mushroom to adjust her height, she was able to finally get into the magical garden of her dreams. By the way, the story begins with a garden, and the whole journey revolves around her desire to get into a beautiful garden. Accident? Hardly. At the beginning, Alice is an innocent little girl sitting in a garden that can be compared to the biblical Garden of Eden. When she's dragged down the rabbit hole, she leaves behind the innocence of her childhood and begins to understand the world more deeply. At the same time, with pain, disappointments, passing tests, she lets go of her childhood innocence. Perhaps there's also a sexual subtext of the loss of virginity. But let's return to the flow of history. It would seem that the goal has been achieved, and it would be possible to rest and enjoy the serenity of a beautiful place. But Already after the first steps in the garden, Alice saw how 3 gardeners who looked like playing cards were repainting the white roses into red ones. And again, the symbolism of transformation, growing up. From the innocent Snow White world of children, the girl, changing, losing her childhood innocence, passes into the world of adulthood, full of vices, temptations, and passions, which is symbolized by the color red. While Alice was surprised by the gardener's behavior, the queen appeared, who immediately screamed hysterically, ordering the girl's head to be cut off. Why was this woman so inadequate? The Red Queen is an authoritarian, cruel, and dogmatic embodiment of the power of the adult world over the childhood world. She carries only fear. She's a childhood nightmare of a girl who, as we can see from the book, was free-spirited. Because the queen is an undisguised embodiment of endless rules and punishments, especially as it was in Victorian times, to keep the child in rigid, often senseless frameworks. Was Alice scared? Of course, but the children's hypertrophied sense of justice forced her to resist the queen, answering her with the single word, nonsense. And surprisingly, the mighty queen stepped back and offered Alice a game of croquet. The girl passed the next point of the quest on the way to building personal boundaries and the ability to fight back against adults. Later, the Duchess joined the game and immediately dragged Alice to the side of the field. She behaved as if Alice were her old and very close acquaintance. What's so strange about that? And the fact that the Duchess was literally glued to the girl, agreeing with her every phrase, huddled closer and closer until her chin began to painfully press into Alice's shoulder. She even expressed a desire to hug the girl tighter, which, fortunately, she had the nerve to refuse. Yes, in the Victorian era, no sexual connection was read in such behavior, especially from the side of women in relation to little girls, but not because it didn't happen, only because they did not want to see her in a decent society. Because such behavior of an adult woman in relation to a little-known child in our time would definitely be alarming, to say the least. The highest point of Alice's incredible trip was the scene in the courtroom. At the head of the court were the King of Hearts and the Queen of Hearts, and the defendant was the Knave of Hearts. When the trial began, and the reason for it was announced, the absurdity continued. Knave was tried for stealing and eating pies baked by the Queen. Alice suddenly felt that she'd begun to grow on her own, without any help. The quest was completed, the path was almost complete, or the influence of the substances began to wear off. She was about to leave the courtroom, but curiosity got the better of her and she stayed. In the end, Alice was called as a witness. She'd already grown so much that she towered over the entire courtroom. When the White Rabbit, as proof, began to read a letter containing an absolutely meaningless poem, Alice's patience finally broke. By that time, she'd already learned to better cope with her problems and regained her identity. She already knew how to overcome a new obstacle. So she ate a piece of mushroom from her pocket and grew even bigger, after which she boldly exclaimed that this whole trial is nonsense. In a meaningless fury, the Queen ordered to execute Alice as well, but she did not care. The Queen was the last obstacle that finally helped Alice become an adult. The girl said that she was no longer afraid because they were all nothing more than a deck of cards. Everything went into a spin here. The cards flew into the air and rushed at her like a swarm of maddened bees, and Alice finally woke up. Or, she finally came to her senses and sobered up. She was lying on the shore, resting her head on her sister's lap. When the girl began to recount her strange adventures, she realized that she was already looking at everything from a completely different perspective. Having traveled this long way, she was no longer the Alice who recklessly went into the unknown after the White Rabbit. Something traumatic and incomprehensible happened to her on that trip, but her psyche, wanting to protect the girl from painful memories, substituted them from her with bright pictures of strange animals, unusual places, and funny conversations. Such a trip happened to the girl Alice with not at all children's adventures and subtexts. But this story, in general, is like that onion. You remove one layer and 20 more appear under it. Therefore, we'll definitely return to it. Only next time we'll consider it from a slightly different angle. This fairy tale is strange, and it will be even stranger and stranger. Therefore, subscribe to this channel and click on the bell to explore other contents of this fairy tale. And if you're interested in learning more about the dark meaning of stories you know from childhood.